James Adair Argument 7. In conformity to, or after the manner of the Jews, the Indian Americans have their prophets, high priests, and others of a religious order. As the Jews had a sanctum sanctorum, or most holy place, so have all the Indian nations, particularly the Muskogee. It is partitioned off by a mud wall about breast high, behind the white seat, which always stands to the left hand of the red-painted war seat. There they deposit their consecrated vessels and supposed holy utensils, none of the laity daring to approach that sacred place, for fear of particular damage to themselves, and general hurt to the people, from the supposed divinity of the place. With the Muskogee, Cheeràtahége signifies cunning men, or persons prescient of futurity, much the same as the Hebrew seers. Cheeràtahége is the name of the pretended prophets, with the Cherokee, and nearly approaches to the meaning of Nebia, the Hebrew name of a prophet. Cheera is their word for fire, and the termination points out men possessed of, or endued with it. The word seems to allude to the celestial cherubim, fire, light, and spirit, which centered in Oea, or Yoa. These Indians call their pretended prophets also Loache, men resembling the holy fire, or as Elohim, for the termination expresses a comparison, and Loa is a contraction of Lok, drawn from Eloah, the singular number of Elohim, the name of the holy ones. And, as the Muskogee, 80, call the noise of thunder, Uroa, so the Cherokee by inverting it, Wura, he is, thereby alluding to the divine essence, and, as those term the lightning Eloah, and believe it immediately to proceed from the voice of Ishtahalo Eloah Aba, it shews the analogy to the Hebrews, and their sentiments to be different from all the early heathen world. The Indian tradition says that their forefathers were possessed of an extraordinary divine spirit, by which they foretold things future, and controlled the common course of nature, and this they transmitted to their offspring, provided they obeyed the sacred laws annexed to it. They believe that by the communication of the same divine fire working on their loch, they can now effect the like. They say it is out of the reach of Nana Ukpru either to comprehend or perform such things, because 85 the beloved fire, or the Holy Spirit of fire, will not cooperate with, or actuate Hadak Ukprus, the accursed people. Ishtahulo is the name of all their priestly order, and their pontifical office descends by inheritance to the eldest, those friend towns, which are firmly confederated in their exercises and plays, never have more than one archimagus at a time. But lameness, contrary to the Mosaic law, it must be confessed, does not now exclude him from officiating in his religious function, though it is not to be doubted, as they are naturally a modest people, and highly ridicule those who are incapable of procreating their species, that formerly they excluded the lame and impotent. They, who have the least knowledge in Indian affairs, know that the martial virtue of the savages obtains them titles of distinction, but yet their old men, who could scarcely correct their transgressing wives, much less go to war, and perform those difficult exercises that are essentially needful in an active warrior, are often promoted to the pontifical dignity, and have great power over the people, by the pretended sanctity of the office. Notwithstanding the Cherokee are now a nest of apostate hornets, pay little respect to gray hairs, and have been degenerating fast from their primitive religious principles, for above 30 years past, yet, before the last war, Old Hop, who was helpless and lame, presided over the whole nation, as Archimagus, and lived in Choate, their only town of refuge. It was entirely owing to the wisdom of those who then presided in South Carolina, that his dangerous pontifical, and regal-like power, was impaired, by their setting up Atacullaculla and supporting him so well, as to prevent the then easy transition of an Indian high priesthood into a French-American bloody chair, with a bunch of red and black beads, where the devil and they could as easily have instructed them in the infernal French catechism, as they did the Canada Indians, as, who killed Christ? Answer, the bloody English. A wrong belief has a most powerful efficacy in depriving men's morals, and a right one has a great power to reform them. The bloody Romish bulls, that France sent over to their Indian converts, clearly prove the former, and our peaceable conduct, as plainly showed the latter, till Britannia sent out her lions to retaliate. To discover clearly the origin of the Indian religious system, I must occasionally quote as much from the Mosaic Institution, 87 as the savages seem to copy after, or imitate, in their ceremonies, and only the faint image of the Hebrew can now be expected to be discerned, as in an old, imperfect glass. The priesthood originally centered with the first male born of every family. With the ancient heathens, the royalty was annexed to it, in a direct line, and it descended in that manner, as low as the Spartans and Romans. But, to secure Israel from falling into heathenish customs and worship, God in the time of Moses set apart the Levites for religious services in the room of the firstborn, and one high priest was elected from the family of Aaron and anointed with oil, who presided over the rest. This holy office descended by right of inheritance. However, they were to be free of bodily defects, and were by degrees initiated to their holy office before they were allowed to serve in it. They were consecrated by having the water of purifying sprinkled upon them, washing all their body and their clothes clean, anointing them with oil, and offering a sacrifice. It is not surprising that the dress of the old savage Archimagus and that of the Levitical high priest is somewhat different. It may well be supposed they wandered from captivity to this far distant wilderness in a distressed condition, where they could scarcely cover themselves from the inclemency of heat and cold. Besides, if they had always been possessed of the greatest affluence, the long want of written records would sufficiently excuse the difference, because oral traditions are liable to variation. However, there are some traces of agreement in their pontifical dress. Before the Indian Archimagus officiates in making the supposed holy fire for the yearly atonement of sin, the Sagan clothes him with a white ephod, which is a waistcoat without sleeves. When he enters on that solemn duty, a beloved attendant spreads a white-dressed buckskin on the white seat, which stands close to the supposed holiest, and then puts some white beads on it that are given him by the people. Then the Archimagus wraps around his shoulders a consecrated skin of the same sort, which reaching across under his arms, he ties behind his back, with 2 knots on the legs, in the form of a figure of 8. Another custom he observes on this solemn occasion is, instead of going barefoot, he wears a new pair of buckskin white moccasins made by himself and stitched with the sinews of the 88 same animal. The upper leather across the toes he paints, for the space of 3 inches, with a few streaks of red, not with vermilion, for that is their continual war emblem, but with a certain red root, its leaves and stalk resembling the ipecacuanha, which is their fixed red symbol of holy things. These shoes he never wears, but in the time of the supposed Passover, for at the end of it, they are laid up in the beloved place, or holiest, where much of the like sort quietly accompanies in heap of old, broken earthenware, conch shells, and other consecrated things. Observant ubi sesta mero pedi sabata regis. Et vitas indulget cenibus clementa porcis. Juvenal, Saturday. 6. James Adair Argument 7. Part 2. When the high priest entered into the holiest, on the day of expiation, he clothed himself in white, and, when he finished that day's service, he laid aside those clothes and left them in the tabernacle. Leviticus 26. When the Egyptian priests went to worship in their temples, they wore shoes of white parchment. Herodotus, Lib 2. Cap 5. The Mosaic ceremonial institutions are acknowledged by our best writers to represent the Messiah under various types and shadows. In like manner, the religious customs of the American Indians seem to typify the same, according to the early divine promise that the seed of the woman should bruise the head of the serpent, and that it should bruise his heel. The Levitical high priest wore a breastplate, which they called hoshchim, and on it the Urim and Thummim, signifying lights and perfections, for they are the plurals of Aurora, which inverted makes Aroa, and Thora, the law, as it directed them under dark shadows, to Messiah, the lamp of light and perfection. In resemblance of this sacred pectoral, or breastplate, the American Archimagus wears a breastplate, made of a white conch shell, with 2 holes bored in the middle of it, through which he puts the ends of an otterskin strap, and fastens a buckhorn white button to the outside of each, as if in imitation of the precious stones of Urim, which miraculously blazoned from the high priest's breast the unerring words of the divine oracle. Instead of the plate of gold, which the Levite wore on his forehead, 89 bearing these words, Kadesh Li-Yowawa, holy, or separate to God, the Indian wears around his temples either a wreath of swan feathers, or a long piece of swanskin doubled, so as only the fine snowy feathers appear on each side. And, in likeness to the tiara of the former, the latter wears on the crown of his head a tuft of white feathers, which they call yatara. He likewise fastens a tuft of blunted wild turkey cockspurs toward the toes of the upper part of his moccasins, as if in resemblance to the 72 bells, which the Levitical high priest wore on his coat of blue. Those are as strong religious pontifical emblems as any old Hebrews could have well chosen or retained under the like circumstances of time and place. Thus appears the Indian Archimagus, not as Maruba begat him, the man with many clothes, as they called the high priest of the Second Temple, but with clothes proper to himself, when he is to officiate in his pontifical function at the annual expiation of sins. As religion is the touchstone of every nation of people, and as these Indians cannot be supposed to have been deluded out of theirs, separated from the rest of the world, for many long-forgotten ages, the traces which may be discerned among them will help to corroborate the other arguments concerning their origin. The only ornaments that distinguished the high priest from the rest were a coat with 72 bells, an ephod, or jacket without sleeves, a breastplate set with 12 stones, a linen mitre, and a plate of gold upon his forehead. These religious, beloved men are also supposed to be in great favor with the deity, and able to procure rain when they please. In this respect also, we shall observe a great conformity to the practice of the Jews. The Hebrew records inform us that in the moon Abib, or Nisan, they prayed for 84, the spring, or latter rain, to be so seasonable and sufficient as to give them a good harvest. And the Indian Americans have a tradition that their forefathers sought for and obtained such seasonable rains as gave them plentiful crops, and they now seek them in a manner agreeable to the shadow of this tradition. When the ground is parched, their rainmakers, as they are commonly termed, are to mediate for the beloved red people with the bountiful Holy Spirit of fire. But their old cunning prophets are not fond of entering on this religious duty, and avoid it as long as they possibly can, till the murmurs of the people force them to the sacred attempt for the security of their own lives. If he fails, the prophet is shot dead, because they are so credulous of his divine power conveyed by the Holy Spirit of fire that they reckon him an enemy to the state, by averting the general good, and bringing desolating famine upon the beloved people. But in general, he is so discerning in the stated laws of nature, and skillful in priestcraft, that he always seeks for rain either at the full or change of the moon, unless the birds, either by instinct or the temperature of their bodies, should direct him otherwise. However, if in a dry season, the clouds, by the veering of the winds, pass wide of their fields, while they are inveighing bitterly against him, some in speech, and others in their hearts, he soon changes their well-known notes. He assumes a displeased countenance and carriage, and attacks them with bitter reproaches for their vicious conduct in the marriage state, and for their notorious pollutions, by going to the women in their religious retirements, and for multifarious crimes that never could enter into his head to suspect them of perpetrating, but that the divinity his holy things were endued with had now suffered a great decay, although he had fasted, purified himself, and on every other account had lived an innocent life, according to the old beloved speech, adding, Lok Ishtahulo will never be kind to bad people. He concludes with a religious caution to the penitent, advising them to mend their manners, and the times will mend with them, then they depart with sorrow and shame. The old women, as they go along, will exclaim loudly against the young people, and protest they will watch their manners very narrowly for the time to come, as they are sure of their own steady virtue. If a 2-year drought happens, the Sanhedrin, at the earnest solicitation of the mortified sinners, convene in a body, and make proper inquiry into the true cause of their calamities, because, say they, it is better to spoil a few roguish people than a few roguish people should spoil Hadaka or Tupa. The lot soon falls upon Jonas, and he is immediately swallowed up. Too much rain is equally dangerous to those red prophets. I was lately told by a gentleman of distinguished character that a famous rainmaker of the Muskogee was shot dead, because the river overflowed their fields to a great height in the middle of August and destroyed their weighty harvest. They ascribed the mischief to his ill will, as the deity, they say, doth not injure the virtuous, and designed him only to do good to the beloved people. In the year 1747, a Natchez warrior told me that while one of their prophets was using his divine invocations for rain, according to the faint image of their ancient tradition, he was killed with thunder on the spot, upon which account, the spirit of prophecy ever after subsided among them, and he became the last of their reputed prophets. They believed the Holy Spirit of fire had killed him with some of his angry darting fire, for willful impurity, and by his threatening voice, forbade them to renew the like attempt, and justly concluded that if they all lived well, they should fare well, and have proper seasons. This opinion coincides with that of the Israelites, in taking fire for the material emblem of Yahweh, by reckoning thunder the voice of the Almighty above, according to the scriptural language, by esteeming thunderstruck individuals under the displeasure of heaven, and by observing and enforcing such rules of purity, as none of the old pagan nations observed, nor any, except the Hebrews. As the prophets of the Hebrews had oracular answers, so the Indian Magi, who are to invoke Yahweh and mediate with the supreme holy fire, that he may give seasonable rains, have a transparent stone, of supposed great power in assisting to bring down the rain, when it is put in a basin of water, by a reputed divine virtue, impressed on one of the like sort, in time of old, which communicates it circularly. This stone would suffer a great decay, they assert, were it even seen by their own laity, but if by foreigners, it would be utterly despoiled of its divine communicative power. Doth not this allude to the precious blazoning stones of Urim and Thummim? In Tithes, a lower Cherokee town, lived one of their reputed great divine men, who never informed the people of his seeking for rain, but at the change, or full of the moon, unless there was some promising sign of the change of the weather, either in the upper regions, or from the feathered calendar, such as the quacking of ducks, the croaking of ravens, and from the moistness of the air felt in their quills. Consequently, he seldom failed of success, which highly increased his name and profits, for even when it rained at other times, they ascribed it to the intercession of their great beloved man. Rainmaking, in the Cherokee Mountains, is not so dangerous an office, as in the rich level lands of the Chickasaw country, near the Mississippi. The above Cherokee prophet had a carbuncle, near as big as an egg, which they said he found where a great rattlesnake lay dead, and that it sparkled with such surprising luster, as to illuminate his dark winter house, like strong flashes of continued lightning, to the great terror of the weak, who durst not upon any account approach the dreadful fire-darting place, for fear of sudden death. When he died, it was buried along with him according to custom, in the townhouse of Tithes, under the great beloved cabin, which stood in the westernmost part of that old fabric, where they who will run the risk of searching, may luckily find it. But, if any of that family detected them in disturbing the bones of their deceased relation, they would resent it as the basest act of hostility. The inhuman conduct of the avaricious Spaniards toward the dead Peruvians and Mexicans irritated the natives to the highest pitch of distraction against those ravaging enemies of humanity. The intense love the Indians bear to their dead is the reason that so few have fallen into the hands of our physicians to dissect or anatomize. James Adair, Argument 7. Part 3. Besides, that the old women were less honest in paying their rainmakers than the English women behaved to their beloved men, unless I had spoken too well of them. The wives of this and the other person, he said, had cheated him in not paying him any portion of the last year's bad crop, which their own bad lives greatly contributed to, as that penurious crime of cheating him of his dues sufficiently testified, not to mention a late custom they had contracted since the general peace, of planting a great many fields of beans and peas in distant places, after the summer crops were over, on the like dishonest principle, likewise in affirming that when the first harvest was over, it rained for nothing. By that means they had blackened the old beloved speech that Ishtahulo of old spoke to his loach, and conveyed down to him, only that they might paint their own bad actions white. He concluded by saying that all the chieftains and others present, as well as myself, knew now very well, from his honest speech, the true cause of the earth's having been so strangely burnt till lately, and that he was afraid, if the hearts of those light and mad people he complained of did not speedily grow honest, the dreadful day would soon come, in which Lok Ishtahulo would send Fuchik Kira Ishto, the great blazing star, Yakaniklena, Lok Lochake, to burn up half of the earth with fire, Firimi Ayub, from the north to the south, Hasiubi Apera, toward the setting of the sun, where they should in time arrive at the dreadful place of darkness, be confined there hungry, and otherwise sorely distressed among hissing snakes and many other frightful creatures, according to the ancient true speech that Ishtahulo Aba spoke to his beloved Loch. Under this argument, I will also mention another striking resemblance to the Jews, as to their tithes, as the sacerdotal office was fixed in the tribe of Levi, they had 48 cities allotted them from the other tribes. And Moses assures us, in Deuteronomy 14:28-29, that those tribes paid them also once in 3 years, the tithe, or tenth of all they possessed, which is supposed to be about the 30th part of their annual possessions, by which means they were reasonably maintained, as spiritual pastors, and enabled to fulfill the extensive and charitable application of their dues, as enjoined. It hath been already hinted, that the Indian prophets undertake by the emanation of the divine spirit of fire, cooperating with them, to bring down proper rains for crops, on the penalty of losing their own lives, as the Indians reckon that a regular virtuous life will sufficiently enable their great beloved men to bring blessings of plenty to the beloved people, and if they neglect it, they are dangerous enemies, and a great curse to the community. They imagine his prophetic power is also restrictive as to winter rains, they doing more hurt than good, for they justly observe that their ground seldom suffers by the want of winter rains. Their sentiments on this head are very strong. They say, Ishtahulo Aba allows the winter rain to fall unsought, but that he commanded their forefathers to seek for the summer rain, according to the old law, otherwise he would not give it to them. If the seasons have been answerable, when the ripened harvest is gathered in, the old women pay their reputed prophet with religious goodwill, a certain proportional quantity of each kind of the new fruits, measured in the same large portable back baskets, wherein they carried home the ripened fruits. This stated method they yearly observe, which is as consonant to the Levitical institution as can be reasonably expected, especially as their traditions have been time out of mind preserved only by oral echo. Modern writers inform us that the purses pay a tithe of their revenues to the chief destar, or archimagus of a city or province, who decides cases of conscience and points of law, according to the institution of Zoroaster, a mixture of Judaism and paganism. Their annual religious offering to the archimagi is a misapplication of the Levitical law concerning tithes, contrary to the usage of the American Aborigines, which it may be supposed they immediately derived from the Hebrews, for, as the 12th tribe was devoted to the divine service, they were by divine appointment, maintained at the public expense. However, when we consider that their government was of a mixed kind, first a theocracy, then by nobles, and by kings, and at other times by their high priest, it seems to appear pretty plain that the deity raised, preserved, and governed those people to oppose idolatry, and continue, till the fullness of time came, the true divine worship on earth, under ceremonial dark shadows, 96 without exhibiting their government in the least, as a plan of future imitation. Besides, as Messiah is come, according to the predictions of the divine oracles, which represented him under various strong types and shadows, surely Christians ought to follow the copy of their humble master and his holy disciples, and leave the fleecing of the flock to the avaricious Jews, whose religious tenets and rapacious principles support them in taking annual tithes from each other, who affect to believe that all the Mosaic law is perpetually binding, and that the predicted Shiloh, who is to be their purifier, king, prophet, and high priest, is not yet come. The law of tithing was calculated only for the religious economy of the Hebrew nation, for as the merciful deity, who was the immediate head of that state, had appropriated the Levites to his service, and prohibited them purchasing land, lest they should be seduced from their religious duties by worldly cares, he, by a most bountiful law, ordered the state to give them the tithe and other offerings, for the support of themselves and their numerous families, and also of the widow, the fatherless, and the stranger. I shall insert a dialogue that formerly passed between the Chickasaw and me, which will illustrate both this and other particulars of the general subject, and also show the religious advantages and arguments by which the French used to undermine us with the Indians. We had been speaking of trade, which is the usual topic of discourse with those craftsmen. I asked him how he could reasonably blame the English traders for cheating Tekab Hama, the red folks, even allowing his accusations to be just, as he, their divine man, had cheated them out of a great part of their crops, and had the assurance to claim it as his religious due, when at the same time, if he had shaken hands with the straight old beloved speech, or strictly observed the ancient divine law, his feeling heart would not have allowed him to have done such black and crooked things, especially to the helpless, the poor, and the aged, It rather would have strongly moved him to stretch out to them a kind and helping hand, according to the old beloved speech of Cheeràtahége to his Hadak Cheeràtahége, who were sufficiently supported at the public expense, and strictly ordered to supply with the greatest tenderness the wants of others. He smartly retorted my objections, telling me that the white people's excuses for their own wrong conduct were as false and weak as my complaints were against him. The red people, he said, saw very clearly through such thin black paint, though his sacred employment was equally hid from them and me, by which means neither of us could reasonably pretend to be proper judges of his virtuous conduct, nor blame him for the necessary effect of our own crimes, or urge it as a plea for cheating him out of his yearly dues, contrary to the old divine speech, for the crops became light by their own vicious conduct, which spoiled the power of his holy things. So that it was visible, both the red and white people were commonly too partial to themselves, and that by the bounty of the supreme fatherly chieftain, it was as much out of his power, as distant from his kindly heart, either to wrong the beloved red people, or the white nothings, and that it became none, except mad light people, to follow the crooked steps of Hadak Ukprus, the accursed people. As there was no interruption to our winter night's chat, I asked him in a friendly manner whether he was not afraid, thus boldly to snatch at the divine power of distributing rain at his pleasure, as it belonged only to the great beloved thundering chieftain, who dwells far above the clouds, in the New Year's unpolluted holy fire, and who gives it in common to all nations of people alike, and even to every living creature over the face of the whole earth, because he made them, and his merciful goodness always prompts him to supply the wants of all his creatures. He told me that by an ancient tradition, their Loch were possessed of an extraordinary divine power, by which they foretold hidden things, and by the beloved speech brought down showers of plenty to the beloved people, that he very well knew, the giver of virtue to nature resided on earth in the unpolluted holy fire, and likewise above the clouds and the sun, in the shape of a fine fiery substance, attended by a great many beloved people, and that he continually weighs us, and measures out good or bad things to us, according to our actions. He added that though the former beloved speech had a long time subsided, it was very reasonable they should still continue this their old beloved custom, especially as it was both profitable in supporting many of their helpless old beloved men, and very productive of virtue, by awing their young people from violating the ancient laws. This showed him to be cunning in priestcraft, if not possessed of a tradition from the Hebrew records, that their prophets by the divine power had, on material occasions, acted beyond the stated laws of nature and wrought miracles. James Adair Argument 7. Part 4. My old prophetic friend told me, with a good deal of surprise, that though the beloved red people had by some means or other lost the old beloved speech, yet French lakin ukpru, the ugly yellow French, as they term the Mississippians, had by some wonderful method obtained it, for his own people, he assured me, had seen them at New Orleans to bring down rain in a very dry season, when they were giving out several bloody speeches to their head warriors against the English Chickasaw traders. On a mischievous politic invitation of the French, several of the Chickasaw had then paid them a visit, in the time of an alarming drought and a general fast, when they were praying for seasonable rains at Mass. When they came, the interpreter was ordered to tell them that the French had holy places and holy things, after the manner of the red people, that if their young people proved honest, they could bring down rain whenever they stood in need of it, and that this was one of the chief reasons which induced all the various nations of the beloved red people to bear them so intense a love, and, on the contrary, so violent and inexpressible an hatred even to the very name of the English, because every one of them was marked with an ukpru, the curse of God. The method the Chickasaw prophet used in relating the affair has some humor in it, for their ignorance of the Christian religion and institutions perplexes them when they are on the subject, on which account I shall literally transcribe it. He told me that the Chickasaw warriors during 3 successive days accompanied the French Loch and Cheeràtahége to the great beloved house, where a large bell hung atop, which strange sight exceedingly surprised them, for, instead of being fit for a horse, it would require a great many 10 horses to carry it. Around the inside of the beloved house, there was a multitude of he and she beloved people, or male and female saints or angels, whose living originals, they affirmed dwelt above the clouds, and helped them to get every good thing from Cheeràtahége, when they earnestly craved their help. The French beloved men spoke a great deal with much warmth, the rest were likewise busily employed in imitation of their Ishtaholo and Loch. At one time they spoke high, at another low. One chose this, and another chose that song. Here the men kneeled 99 before the images of their she-beloved people, there the women did the like before their favorite and beloved he pictures, entreating them for some particular favor which they stood in need of. Some of them, he said, made very wild motions over their heads and breasts, and others struck their stomachs with a vehemence like their warriors, when they drink much ukahoma, bitter waters, or spirituous liquor, while every one of them had a bunch of mixed beads, to which they frequently spoke, as well as counted over, that they loved these beads, for our people strictly observed, they did not give them to their Loch and Ishtaholo, as the red people would have done to those of their own country, though it was very plain they deserved them, for beating themselves so much for the young people's roguish actions, and likewise for laboring so strongly in pulling off their clothes, and putting them on again, to make the beloved physic work, which they took in small pieces, to help to bring on the rain. On the third day, added he, they brought it down in great plenty, which was certainly a very difficult performance, and as surprising too, that they who are always, when opportunity answers, persuading the red people to take up the bloody hatchet against their old steady friends, should still have the beloved speech, which Ishtaholo Aba Aloha formerly spoke to his beloved Loch. Thus ended our friendly discourse.